Good Friday morning. I hope you have a good cup of coffee as we're going to take a look at Friday, Good Friday, the day of crucifixion for Jesus. Jesus stood before 6 trials on this day. Ananias, who was not an actual high priest, but was a powerful influence on the high priest's office. In John chapter 18, verse 19, Jesus was asked about his disciples and their doctrine. Jesus said, I spoke openly. He said, I taught in the synagogue and the temples. He also said, in secret, I have said nothing. Ask those who have heard. Indeed, they know what I've said. When he answered this way, one of the guards struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, you do not answer a high priest like that. And then Caiaphas was a Jewish council. And clearly they had assembled a council together very hastily in anticipation of passing judgment on Jesus. The council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. And at last, 2 false witnesses came forward, and they said, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. After putting him under an oath by the living God, Jesus answered and said, It is as you said. At this point, they had no further need of any other witnesses or trials. They were quick to judgment. The high priest tore Jesus' clothes, saying, he is blaspheming. And they asked, what do we need to do in response? And in response, they said, he is deserving of death. Then they spat in his face and they beat him. And others struck him with their palms of their hands, saying, prophesy to us, Christ, who is the one who struck you? By this time, Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. The Sanhedrin was the 3rd trial that Jesus stood before. This was a quick one. In the morning, the chief priest and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death in Matthew chapter 27. And in verse 3, Judas returns the 30 pieces of silver and then goes and hangs himself. Jesus is brought before Pilate, and Pilate questioned Jesus and said, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus answered and said to him, it is as you say. Pilate heard of Galilee, and he asked if this man was a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod. Now Herod had heard many things about Jesus, and he had hoped to see him because he was wanting to see some of the miracles that Jesus had been doing. But when Jesus was questioned by Herod, Jesus did not answer him at all. So Herod and his men of war mocked him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. And when he returned to Pilate, Pilate sat in the seat of judgment. And about this time, Pilate's wife came and said to him, have nothing to do with this man, for I have had many bad dreams about him all day today. However, the elders and the chief priests persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas, because see, at this time at the governor's dinner, it was customary to release one prisoner. And they would shout, give us Barabbas, give us Barabbas. And Pilate is like, but this man has done nothing wrong. So Pilate said in front of everybody, in a basin of water, he said, I wash my hands of this man's blood. But the chief priests and the elders, they say, that is fine, his blood is on us. Pilate had Jesus removed and scourged Jesus, and then he delivered him to be crucified. So let's talk about the crucifixion for just a few minutes. At the time of Jesus' death, crucifixion was considered the most painful and degrading form of capital punishment in the Roman Empire. It was considered so horrible that it was used by the Romans only for slaves, those from the provinces under their control, and the lowest type of criminals. It was not used for the Roman citizens. Peter was crucified, but Paul, a Roman citizen, he was beheaded. The condemned person was first scourged with a flagellum, and it was a whip It was a whip like this. It had leather thongs with bits of metal and bone attached. The whip would greatly weaken the victim, who then had to carry the crossbeam to the place of execution. Now you have to understand, when a victim was whipped, the whip wasn't intended to kill him. The whip was just intended to torture him. And the Romans had it figured that they could whip a man 39 times before it would take his life. That 40th hit would take his life. And the torturer would not want to rob the executioner of the execution of the cross. So what would happen is they would put the cross or the beam, and the victim would have to carry the cross or the beam out to the execution site, which was Golgotha. And a lot of times they would take and they would nail a piece of paper signifying what the crime that this individual had committed. They would either put it around their neck or they would attach it to the cross. The person was stripped naked and laid on the ground with the crossbeam under his shoulders. And then they would tie his hands or they would nail him. And I found a replica of a nail through some research that they would use to nail people to the cross. And what they would do is they would nail right here in the wrist so that the wrist bone could hold. If they nailed it through here, then it would just slide between the fingers because there's nothing there to hold the nail in place. So they would nail, and then they would overlap the feet and nail the feet. Now the cross was usually just high enough off the ground where they couldn't touch the ground, but it was close. Some say they would put a little wedge under their backside so that they could support themselves just a little bit. But the purpose of the cross was strictly for execution, a horrid execution. And as Jesus was being led to Golgotha, they laid the cross on a man named Simon who was coming from the country, that he might bear the cross for Jesus. And they nailed on the top of the cross a sign that read, "This is the King of the Jews." That was his crime. There were two criminals that were hung with Jesus at that time, one on either side. And one criminal blasphemed and said, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." But the other answered and rebuked him, saying, "Do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive due reward for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And then he said to Jesus, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus said to him, "Assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Now I want to read right from the Bible as Jesus is dying on the cross in Luke chapter 23, verse 44. And it said, "Now it was about the 6th hour that there was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. Then the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. And when Jesus had cried out in a loud voice, he said, 'Father, unto my hands I commit my spirit.' Having said this, he breathed his last. So when the centurion saw what had happened, he glorified God, saying, 'Certainly this was a righteous man.' And the whole crowd who came together to that sight, seeing what had been done, beat their breast and returned. But for all his acquaintances and the women who followed him from Galilee, they stood at a distance watching these things." And friend, that is what took place on Good Friday. So I want you to remember the price that Jesus went through for you so that you could walk in freedom. Listen, friend, be blessed, have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow.